Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a time that smells a little different. Before toothpaste, before showers, before anyone thought soap was a good idea. Tonight we're drifting into the dark, grimy heartbeat of the Middle Ages and a world where filth wasn't a problem, it was just life. If that sounds unpleasant, that's because it is. But don't worry, we'll take it slow. Before you sink into the covers, take a second to like the video if you actually enjoy these long, sleepy dives into the weird corners of history. Leave a comment to tell me where you're listening from, or if you've ever wondered how people managed to survive centuries without deodorant. Now dim the lights, pull the blanket up to your chin and let's begin. Not in a palace or a battlefield, but in a small, smoky room that hasn't seen a bath in months. Welcome to the beautifully disgusting world of medieval hygiene. You might imagine that after trudging through a medieval day, through muck and sweat, through horse dung and hearth smoke, the idea of a warm bath would sound like heaven. But in this world, it didn't. It sounded risky, maybe even sinful, because for most of the Middle Ages, bathing wasn't a sign of health, it was a sign of weakness. People truly believed that hot water opened the pores, and those pores were little gateways, not to freshness, but to sickness. If you softened your skin, you were practically begging the plague to walk right in. Disease didn't come from bacteria or viruses, not yet. It drifted through the air in invisible clouds of corruption, seeping into your body through any foolishly opened pore. So people learned to stay sealed. Dirt wasn't filth, it was armor. Sweat was the skin's own medicine, and if someone insisted on washing too often, well, that smelled suspicious. You can almost hear the old advice whispered in the dark corners of a cottage. Keep your body closed, keep your spirit pure. And so they did. You step through the crooked lanes of a medieval town, the kind that feels like it's leaning in on itself. The houses are close enough that their upper floors touch. The air between them hangs heavy, stale. A single gutter runs down the middle, carrying whatever people decide to pour into it. Chamber pots, pig waste, rainwater when it comes. The scent is complicated. It's not just bad, not in the way you might think. It's layered. The earthy musk of unwashed wool, the sour tang of ale and sweat, the soft rot of hay trampled underfoot. Horses breathe hot clouds into the chill morning air. A woman sells onions from a wicker basket, the smell sharp and clean against everything else. People move slowly through it all, wrapped in rough fabrics that haven't been truly washed in months, maybe years. Their faces shine not with moisture, but with the dull gloss of oil and dust. And no one looks uncomfortable. This is just life. Cleanliness to them meant something very different. It wasn't about the body, it was about the soul. You could be smeared in dirt and still be clean if you confessed, if you prayed, if your conscience was unblemished. Soap could do nothing for sin, so why bother with it? Still, not everyone resisted the lure of hot water. In towns and cities, bathhouses sprang up, echoing the old Roman traditions that lingered like ghosts across Europe. They were warm, fragrant places, steam curling off tubs, herbs floating on the surface, laughter echoing off tiled walls. But here's the problem. Once you get a group of half-naked people in a warm, steamy room, things tend to escalate. By the 13th and 14th centuries, bathhouses weren't just places for washing, they were places for everything. Eating, drinking, gossiping, flirting, and more often than not, sinning. Some were family-friendly, others were absolutely not. And the church, of course, took notice. Priests warned that such places tempted the flesh. Moral panic simmered. Bathhouses were shut down again and again. Sometimes for public health during outbreaks, but often for immorality. It was whispered that virtue could not survive in a room where people took their clothes off. So people adjusted, they wiped instead of washed. They sponged themselves down with vinegar or wine. They used scented cloths to dab away the worst of the grime. Clean enough became a kind of compromise. The faint whiff of rosemary water, the feel of linen scraped across the skin. If you were rich, you had your own private tub, usually a giant wooden barrel lined with linen. Servants would pour in water heated over the hearth, perhaps drop in some herbs or milk if your skin was delicate. But even nobles bathed rarely, maybe a few times a year. The rest of the time, they simply covered the smell. Layers of fabric, layers of perfume, layers of denial. Down in the streets, it was different. Peasants lived near animals, with animals really. Goats in the yard, pigs underfoot, hens roosting by the hearth. A daily wash meant a bucket, a rag, and a lot of willpower. Most didn't bother. Water itself wasn't always safe. Wells went foul, rivers ran with waste. People said water could make you sick, and they weren't entirely wrong. So they drank ale instead, thin and sour, but boiled, safe. They washed less and survived longer, and that's how dirt became wisdom. You keep walking through the town square, watching a baker sweep yesterday's ashes out onto the cobbles. A man sharpens a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape lost under the neighing of horses. A cart rolls by, wheels sunk in slush. The air is alive with flies, with the smell of tallow and bread and smoke. It's strange, mate. There's something almost cozy about it. A world without soap has its own kind of intimacy. Every person carries the scent of their life on their skin. Sweat from their labor, smoke from their fire, earth from their floor. It's all part of the same story. You pass a narrow alley and glimpse the faded sign of a bathhouse, its door barred, its windows dark. Once, it would have been alive with chatter and laughter. Steam rising from wooden tubs, a blur of hands and cloth and bubbles. A place to escape the cold for a few hours. Now it's just another shuttered memory. People whisper that bathing too often leads to weakness. It drains the body's strength, they say, makes the skin soft and vulnerable. Better to be tough, sturdy, sealed against the world. A bit of grime was proof you worked hard, that you were real, that you didn't care for vanity. And so, dirt became virtue. Cleanliness, suspicion. Still, you can imagine the rare nights when someone risked it, when they filled a basin, stripped down in the firelight, and dared to feel clean for once. The warmth spreading over their skin, the strange lightness afterward, the scent of lavender or mint rising for just a moment before the smoke swallowed it again. Maybe it even felt holy, but it didn't last. By morning the sweat and soot would return. The same clothes, the same air, the same life. Bathing was too brief, too risky, too strange to make sense. You pass a group of boys running barefoot through the muck, laughing, chasing each other through puddles of who knows what. One of them stops to scratch at his head, hard, then grins and keeps going. You can almost hear the tiny hiss of lice shifting through hair, the soft sound of skin meeting rough wool. A quiet rhythm of medieval life, always there, always close. You pause, watching as a mother bends over her daughter in the doorway of a cottage. The little girl squirms as her mother drags a fine-toothed comb through her hair. Something flicks into the fire. The girl sighs. The mother smiles, relieved, because here, in this world where water was feared, there were other ways of keeping clean. Ways that didn't involve baths at all. You don't have to look far to find life in a medieval household. It's already crawling all over it. Not the kind of life that sings or laughs, but the tiny, persistent kind. The kind that feeds quietly, hides in folds, and comes out when the candles go dark. Tonight, we move closer, literally closer, right to the skin. Imagine it, you're wrapped in layers of rough wool or heavy linen, the air inside your clothes warmer than the room itself. The fabric itches, the seams rub, and somewhere under it all, something moves. It's not imagination, it's company. In the Middle Ages, people didn't just live with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. They accepted them. They were as much a part of daily life as bread or prayer. Everyone had them. Peasants, priests, queens, all equal in the eyes of the itch. There's something almost democratic about it. You run a hand through your hair, and you can feel the roughness of your own scalp, dry and tight from weeks without washing. The little creatures thrive there, slipping between strands, hiding at the roots, feeding where the skin is softest. And yet no one seems particularly alarmed. They're simply expected. In fact, you might find yourself sitting by the fire one evening, comb in hand, scraping through hair that's more alive than you'd like to admit. The sound is oddly satisfying. That faint, rhythmic scritch of teeth against scalp, followed by the tiny pop as something unfortunate meets its end between your fingernails. It's not just self-care, it's social care. People deloused each other the way we might share a chat over tea. A wife picking through her husband's collar, a mother checking her children before bed, two friends trading gossip as they inspect each other's hair. It's oddly tender, an act of patience, attention, trust. Sometimes it's even flirtatious. There are records of lovers searching one another for lice, laughing softly, turning an ordinary irritation into intimacy. There's nothing like shared disgust to bring people closer, and the bugs weren't picky. Lice lived in hair, yes, but they also colonized the seams of clothing, especially along the shoulders and waist. Fleas favored the warm corners of bedding, the straw mattresses, the folds of cloaks. Bedbugs, those ancient travelers, hid in wooden frames and cracked plaster, waiting for the quiet of night. You can almost picture it. A medieval bed, a sturdy wooden frame, ropes crisscrossing beneath a sack of straw, sheets that haven't been washed in months, and blankets that smell faintly of smoke, wool, and humanity. You climb in, pull the covers close, and feel the faint tickle of movement against your ankle. It's just the night shift beginning. And yet, for all the crawling and biting, people didn't consider these creatures an outrage. They were simply part of the ecosystem of home. You could brush them away, comb them out, burn them when found, but you'd never truly be rid of them. So, instead of fighting, most just learned to coexist. Delousing, when it happened, became almost ceremonial. On quiet evenings, families would sit by the hearthlight, the orange glow flickering over bent heads. Mothers combed daughters, husbands scratched under collars. Occasionally, you'd hear the faint click as a louse met a thumb and nail, followed by the satisfied sigh of a small victory. A travelling friar once described entering a peasant home and seeing everyone calmly picking through each other's hair, chatting as if they were shelling peas. He called it a sign of affection. Maybe he was right. Even royalty wasn't spared. Kings and queens might have gold-threaded robes and feather mattresses, but beneath it all, they were just as delicious to a hungry flea. Queen Elizabeth I owned a personal knit comb, finely carved from ivory. Louis XIV's palace was so thick with bedbugs that courtiers joked about who would get the fewest bites that night. Even the mighty Charlemagne, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, is said to have scratched so vigorously during a council meeting that his advisors politely looked away. No perfume, no crown, no divine right could keep the bugs at bay. In monasteries, monks shaved their head, not for fashion, but for hygiene. The tonsure wasn't just symbolic humility, it was pest control. Easier to delouse the top when it's mostly gone. And still they scratched beneath their hoods in the dim quiet of prayer, the sound of wool on scalp echoing softly in the stone halls. You can imagine the feeling of it. that momentary relief when a nail finds the exact spot, when the itch gives way to warmth. It's strangely human, almost meditative. And when the scratching stopped, the talking often continued. People gossiped, laughed, and told stories. Lice were just part of the background rhythm of life, like the creak of wood or the drip of rain through thatched roofs. Of course, fleas were a different matter. They were livelier, bolder, and infinitely more athletic. A flea could jump 30 times its own height, which, if you were human-sized, would be like leaping over a castle wall. They lived in the straw, scattered on floors, in bedding, even in the clothes piled in corners. When you sat down, they moved in. When you stood up, they followed. The average medieval home was a moving buffet for them, and they took full advantage. People tried remedies, of course. They sprinkled herbs like lavender and wormwood in their beds, hung sachets of mint and rosemary around their necks, and burned dried sage on the hearth. Fleas didn't mind much. They simply jumped higher. And then there were the bedbugs, the quiet assassins of sleep. They left their mark, little trails of bites along the arms, the neck, the ankles. People blamed bad air or curses or moonlight, but never the small brown insects tucked away in the wood grain beside them. A medieval traveller might wake up scratching, shrug, and mutter something like, "The night spirits were lively," before moving on with his day. If you had servants, you might have them air your mattress or beat your blankets over a railing. If you didn't, you'd just shake them yourself, watch the dust and bits of straw scatter in the light, and call it good enough. Even clothing was its own tiny zoo. Without frequent washing, garments became warm, cozy havens for lice eggs. Knits, they were called, stuck firmly to fibres, white dots against dark cloth. The longer you wore your clothes, the more they came alive. But here's the thing, there's a kind of strange peace in the way medieval people accepted all this. They didn't see themselves as dirty. They saw themselves as ordinary. This was the world. This was the smell of it, the feel of it, the hum of it. You scratch, you chat, you laugh. Maybe you hold a candle close to a sleeve and watch the tiny creatures scatter into shadow, their movement almost mesmerizing. Then you blow out the flame, pull your blanket up, and drift off again. Every now and then, someone might boast about being cleaner than their neighbors. Fewer bites this week, fewer eggs in the seams. But it was all relative. No one escaped the itch. And in a strange way, that shared discomfort was unifying. Everyone knew the scratch, the sting, the faint rustle in the night. You picture the morning, sunlight creeping through wooden shutters, people stirring awake, rubbing their eyes, stretching, and then, inevitably, scratching. A universal gesture. The first order of business before bread or prayer. There's humor in it too, if you squint. Imagine a king addressing his court with a grand speech about divine destiny, only to pause mid-sentence and discreetly reach under his collar. Imagine a knight polishing his armor, scratching his leg with the other hand, muttering about honor and fleas. Even the great heroes of legend were probably itchy. Lancelot may have loved Guinevere, but he also likely shared a bed with something that loved him just as much. And so the Middle Ages went on, buzzing softly beneath the surface, a world alive in more ways than one. As night falls again, you can almost feel it. The faint brush of linen against skin, the warmth under the blankets, the little flicker of movement you try to ignore. Somewhere nearby, someone lifts a chamber pot lid, yawning, half awake. Because soon, morning will bring its own challenges. And in this world, cleanliness had many meanings. Some of them far less pleasant than others. Now let's take another step. A bit more private, a bit closer to the intimate details of daily life. Imagine walking through the corridors of a medieval castle. It's cold and draughty, with stone walls that seem to absorb the heat and the scent of the inhabitants. And somewhere, tucked into a corner, or perhaps jutting out over the moat, is the latrine. Yes, the latrine. That simple wooden seat with a hole suspended over a pit or directly above the flowing water of a moat. You might think this is where dignity ends, and in a way you'd be right. But for people of the Middle Ages, it was just life. In castles, these latrines were the closest thing to plumbing, though the term might be too generous. A hole in the floor, a plank to sit upon, and the occasional swoosh as the waste disappeared into the watery abyss below. No toilet paper, instead rags, moss, or the back of the hand, cleaned in a corner of water, reused or tossed. The richer you were, the more elaborate the arrangements, a carved wooden seat, a curtain for privacy, perhaps even a small bucket of water to rinse with. Outside the castle, in the streets of towns and villages, things were less refined. Toilets were optional. Chamber pots sat under beds, often in reach of the sleeper, ready for nighttime use. By morning, they were emptied into the gutter or the nearest ditch. In some cases, people simply leaned out of a window and shouted the warning, "Gardez-le," French for watch out for water, just before dumping the contents onto the unsuspecting cobblestones below. You can picture it, a narrow street, the rising sun catching on piles of refuse. Waste mingles with mud, spilled ale, horse dung, and scraps of food. Flies buzz lazily through the warm air, tracing invisible paths over every surface. The smell is layered. Not just one thing, but a tapestry of scents. Human sweat, animal excrement, the faintly sour tang of unwashed bodies, the acrid hint of smoke from hearths, and the subtle rot of yesterday's food. To our modern noses it might be unbearable. To a medieval inhabitant, it was simply normal. Even in wealthier homes, the smellscape wasn't much different. Servants and animals shared spaces. Kitchens were often adjacent to sleeping quarters. A rich lord might have a private garderobe, a small room with a seat over a chute. But the air carried the mingled perfume of everyday life, cooking, washing, and yes, waste. And the streets were alive. Children played among the refuse, pigs rummaged happily, and the occasional merchant carried his wares carefully above the muck. People called this home. It was messy, odorous, sometimes dangerous, but it was ordinary. Waste management was practical, if unpredictable. Moats served multiple purposes: defense, decoration, and in some cases sewage disposal. Tossing waste into the water might have seemed convenient, though it hardly improved hygiene. Ponds and rivers bore the same burden, running through towns like sluggish veins carrying all the day's sins away, or at least downstream. Imagine the daily rhythm. Morning brings the chamber pot emptied, the streets wet and glistening with a mixture of water and excrement. You pass a butcher dumping offal, the smell is rich, tangy, almost edible from a distance. A horse trots past, leaving another layer on the already complex aroma of the town. Flies rise in lazy spirals, settling again on the roof of a tavern, on a child's hair, on the corner of a cloak. In private homes, people coped with their own systems: small latrines in corner rooms, buckets tucked discreetly under beds, rags or moss for wiping. It was a world without flushing, without modern plumbing, without the invisible cleansing of water pipes and treatment plants. It was a world in which waste was not hidden. It was visible, immediate, and unavoidable. Even in grand castles, the mechanics could be charmingly crude: a wooden seat, a narrow chute, the occasional rat scurrying beneath. You sit, you do your business, and gravity and a bit of luck take care of the rest. There's a quiet efficiency to it, not pleasant perhaps, but functional. And when night falls, the faint odors of yesterday's use still cling to the stone walls, settling into the corners like dust. Smells were a constant companion. They mingled, layered upon each other, creating the medieval equivalent of background music. Everyone, from peasant to noble, carried these scents with them. They clung to clothing, hair, even skin. Soap was rare, sometimes perfumed, sometimes purely symbolic, and seldom enough to erase the daily contributions of a town, a castle, or a single household. It's easy to imagine stepping into a medieval home and feeling that invisible cloak of odor wrap around you. At first it's sharp, the sharp tang of sweat, the sour bite of old ale, the earthy stink of animals. But after a moment, you stop noticing. Your senses adjust. This is the air you breathe, the smell of life, the smell of survival. And yet, people tried. People always tried. Ashes, vinegar, and herbs were scattered in rooms and beds. Rags were rinsed in cold water when possible. Streets were sometimes hosed with water in the summer. Priests and officials lectured about cleanliness, not always for comfort, but for morality. The effort was there, however limited, but mostly medieval people adapted. They developed a tolerance. They learned to live in proximity to smells that would make a modern nose recoil. They walked past piles of waste, past overflowing gutters, past pigs rooting in the mud, and considered it just another part of daily life. Some towns even organized communal efforts. A town watchman might patrol with a broom or a pail, nudging the worst piles aside, sweeping away the worst of the muck. It didn't eliminate the problem, but it shaped the streets enough to walk through them without immediately gagging. In inns and taverns, chamber pots and buckets were emptied at dawn, and the morning chorus of clattering wood and running water accompanied the first stirrings of the day. You could feel the rhythm of human life, punctuated by small acts of sanitation. A careful pour, a scrape of a broom, the discreet disposal of waste into a gutter or a cart. And in the quiet of private homes, the daily routines continued. The chamber pot under the bed, the small bucket in the corner, emptied with care, or tossed recklessly out the window. A warning cry of "Gardyloo" would ring out, echoing against stone walls and cobbled streets, startling the passerby who had come to expect such chaos. It was, in a sense, a world entirely immersed in its own waste. Not dirty in a moral sense, but thoroughly, inescapably present. It was life itself, manifest in the smells, textures, and sights that filled every corner of medieval existence. And yet, for all the odor, for all the piles and the overflowing pots, life carried on. People laughed, they worked, they feasted, they prayed. The smell of waste was as natural as the smell of bread baking in the oven, or the tang of ale in the tavern. It was ordinary. You step carefully through the town square again, past puddles of stagnant water and the occasional splatter from a careless bucket. The air is thick with history, with human persistence, with the strange intimacy of shared survival. And somewhere underfoot, the faint tickle of insects continues, reminding you that hygiene is relative, and that even in this world of open waste, life goes on. And as the day stretches on, the inevitability of human needs continues to shape every corner of existence. You hear a child giggle as they leap past a small heap, a cart creaks across the uneven cobbles, and somewhere a cat curls into the sun on a patch of refuse. All of this, all of these scents, textures, and movements is just the background rhythm of medieval life, a world where toilets were optional, smells were constant, and survival meant learning to coexist with what we now consider intolerable. Soon, the rhythms of daily life bring us even closer, not just to the outside smells of towns and castles, but to the most personal of details. The teeth, the mouths, the breath of the people themselves. The next layer of medieval intimacy awaits, where decay and neglect meet the human desire for sustenance, and the lessons of hygiene become even more tangible. Now let's drift a little closer, to a place most of us keep covered, a place we rarely think about until something goes wrong: the mouth. That warm, wet chamber where food becomes fuel, where speech emerges, where life meets its first bite. In the Middle Ages, it was also a realm of persistent decay and quiet horror. Dental care as we know it didn't exist. Toothpaste, toothbrushes, floss, none of it. Herbs, vinegar, and a few superstitious remedies were the closest people came to oral hygiene. A person might rub their gums with sage or rosemary, chew cloves to freshen breath, or rinse with a mouthful of sour wine or vinegar. Sometimes they even used urine in the belief that its ammonia would clean teeth. Don't worry, the smell was potent enough to make most people think twice about tasting it. Imagine the morning in a noble household. The sun is soft on the stone walls. Candles flicker, throwing golden light across polished oak tables. Servants move quietly, bringing platters of bread, cheese, and cured meats. A noble sits, straight-backed and proud, reaching for a goblet of spiced wine. They smile, a polite, practiced smile, and you notice the teeth. Grey, black, or missing entirely. Cavities like tiny caverns pocked across molars. The enamel, worn thin from coarse grains and acidic wines, glints dully in the morning light. A few stubborn herbs stuck between teeth, remnants of a desperate attempt at cleanliness. And yet, the noble seems entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely indifferent. To them, this is normal, this is life, this is what a mouth looks like. For the common folk, the scene is even less forgiving. Peasants gnawed on coarse bread, roots, and occasionally salted meat. Their teeth were stained brown from tannins, pitted with decay from the high sugar of honey and dried fruits. Toothaches were common, sometimes so severe they could barely eat, but the remedies were often as harsh as the pain. A small piece of hot metal applied to the gum, a poultice of herbs and vinegar pressed against the jaw, or simply pulling the tooth with pliers or forceps. There was little anesthesia and much superstition. Sometimes a tooth would be extracted because it was believed to be poisoned or the source of illness elsewhere in the body. Children fared no better. A baby's first teeth often became infected, and a mother might rub them with salt or herbal concoctions to ease the swelling. But the cycle of neglect and crude treatment continued generation after generation, and the breath, oh, the breath. In a world without regular brushing, mouthwash, or even consistent rinsing with water, it carried the stories of the previous meal, the herbs, the decay, the hidden infections. Morning breath was not merely unpleasant, it could be a weapon. Close your eyes and imagine leaning in to speak with someone, and the air carries the tang of stale wine, rotting meat, and herbs crushed to cover it. It's potent, unmistakable, and entirely unremarkable to those who lived within it. Nobles tried, sometimes with more resources. They kept small sticks to scrape teeth or chewed aromatic roots. Herbs like sage, mint, or rue were used to mask the rot. But these were disguises, not solutions, and sometimes the remedies themselves did more harm than good. Vinegar eroded enamel, and abrasive powders wore down teeth over the years. A quiet morning meal in a great hall illustrates it perfectly. Sunlight streams across tapestries. The noble picks at a piece of bread, pauses to sip wine, then smiles again. Each tooth tells a story. The upper left molar darkened and pitted, the front incisors chipped from hard grains, the canine worn by years of chewing tough meat. It's like staring at a miniature geological map, carved in enamel and decay. And yet everyone eats, laughs, converses as if nothing is unusual. In towns and villages the daily diet contributed further. Bread made from coarse, stone-ground flour, sometimes mixed with sand or grit, wore down teeth faster than disease alone. Honey and preserved fruits, rare but treasured, added sweetness that bred cavities. A mouth became a landscape of rough textures, acidic erosion, and occasional abscesses. Some people believed that decay was caused by moral failings or by spirits hiding in the teeth. Charms were tied around the head, amulets worn, prayers muttered while rubbing the gums. Toothaches were not merely physical, they were metaphysical, a punishment, a warning, a test of endurance. Dentists, as we think of them today, were rare. Instead, barber surgeons often doubled as tooth pullers. They were skilled in bleeding, lancing boils, and removing teeth, sometimes with little more than a pair of forceps and a prayer. The extraction could be swift, brutal, and memorably painful, leaving behind a gap that would fester until another crude remedy or tooth was extracted to make room. Children watched this process, learning early that teeth were fragile, transient, and dangerous. Their parents' cracked smiles and missing molars were both warning and expectation. Survival often meant enduring pain, adapting to decay, and learning the art of managing discomfort with herbs, vinegar, and stoic patience. And yet, there was a strange intimacy to it. Families rubbed gums together, shared advice, passed down small secret remedies, chew on a sprig of mint, rinse with wine, brush with a cloth dipped in salt. Teeth became a quiet center of care, an ongoing negotiation between survival, discomfort, and the human desire to keep smiling. In quiet corners of monasteries, monks experimented with medicinal herbs, tinctures, and poultices. They wrote down recipes trying to understand the mysteries of enamel, pulp, and gums, yet even their diligence couldn't overcome the limitations of the age. Cavities were inevitable, tooth loss was normal, breath carried the unmistakable signature of decay, regardless of effort. At feasts, this reality was on display for everyone. Platters of cheese, roasted meat, bread, and fruit filled the tables. Courtiers smiled and chewed, their mouths revealing the story of their diets and hygiene habits. Some teeth glinted dully, others darkened to almost black. A few had vanished entirely, leaving gaps that affected speech, expression, even the way utensils were held. But conversation continued, laughter continued, life continued. There was also a gentle humor in it. Imagine a noble leaning in to whisper a secret, unaware that the words were accompanied by the bouquet of weeks of decay. Imagine a peasant with a toothache so severe they could barely eat, yet they still join in the morning prayers, gnashing and grimacing in rhythm with the chant. Everyone shared this vulnerability, from king to stable hand, bound by the same frailty of enamel. Even pets could suffer in proximity. Dogs and cats, often fed scraps from human meals, sometimes developed dental issues of their own, and their breath mingled with human odors in close quarters. Life in the Middle Ages was intimate in ways we can barely imagine. Bodies, smells, and decay intertwined under a single roof, sharing warmth, sustenance, and, inevitably, disease. Yet people persisted. Teeth of stone and gums of iron became a badge of endurance. Herbs and vinegar were not miracles but tools of resilience. A smile, however grey or blackened, was still a smile. Breath, however foul, was still breath. And through it all, life carried on. Meals were eaten, conversations had, prayers recited, and the quiet rhythm of existence continued to beat, as regular as the scraping of a knife across coarse bread. And so as you sit with the memory of a morning meal in a medieval hall, the nobles smiling across the table, the faint clink of cutlery, and the rich aroma of bread and wine mingling with less pleasant scents, you begin to understand. Clean teeth were optional, pain was inevitable, and life, messy and intimate, persisted. Soon, though, even these limitations of hygiene were tempered by another layer, a layer designed not to cleanse, but to disguise. A world where scent was a survival tool, and perfume became the bridge between decay and dignity. Now let's step lightly into the chambers of the noble class, where the world of filth and fashion collided in ways both elaborate and, to our modern eyes, almost absurd. Here, the stench of a week without a bath might mingle with the aroma of spiced wine and roasted meats, and yet appearances mattered. A noble's scent was a carefully orchestrated performance, a survival tool in a society that tolerated few social sins, but tolerated dirt even less when it became offensive to others. Imagine the ritual of dressing in the morning. You rise in a chamber where thick tapestries hang heavy on the walls, muffling the sounds of a bustling castle outside. Servants scurry about, bringing garments of velvet, silk, and brocade. The first task isn't brushing hair or combing the teeth, it's layering the body in fabric that will both impress and protect. Linen chemises go on first, soft against the skin, though rarely washed. Over them, heavier layers of wool or silk, embroidered with gold or dyed in deep, rich colors, trap the smells of the body beneath, holding in what modesty or olfactory tolerance allows. And then comes the perfume. It isn't merely a cosmetic flourish, it is necessity. Sprigs of rosemary or lavender tucked into the folds of sleeves. Pomanders, little balls filled with cloves, ambergris or mace, swinging lightly from the belt or hanging on a chain around the neck. Rose water sprinkled carefully over hands, neck, and even hair, creating a faint floral haze that mingles with the ever-present tang of sweat, smoke, and, sometimes, decay. These scents do more than please the nose. They serve as armor, a way to assert social dominance over the natural realities of the body. The rich didn't just cover themselves, they curated their odors. Each layer, each drop, each sprinkle was a strategic choice. Herbs might ward off infection, or at least they were believed to. Roses and violets disguised the stench of unwashed skin. Spices masked the evidence of indulgence at feast. Pomanders served not only to perfume, but to protect against disease, against miasma, against the judgments of others. Clothing itself became part of this ritual. Furs draped over shoulders, collars stiff with starched linen, sleeves scented with herbs, gloves perfumed to obscure the smell of fingers that had touched everything from animal hides to the unwashed hands of servants. Even shoes carried aromatic inserts, fragrant moss or dried flowers pressed into the soles. The body, wrapped in layers of color and scent, became both spectacle and shield. The act of dressing was slow, almost ceremonial. Servants helped tie laces, adjust sleeves, pin brooches, and tuck pomanders safely into pockets. Each movement was careful, deliberate, ensuring that nothing, no fold, no seam, no dangling ornament, betrayed the reality beneath. The noble emerged like a carefully painted tableau, poised, fragrant, and outwardly impeccable, while the truth of daily life, the sweat, the unwashed skin, the inevitable body odors, lay hidden beneath a fortress of fabrics and fragrance. Perfume was also communication. It signaled wealth, taste, and refinement. It broadcast sophistication, a mastery over one's environment and one's own body. A hint of rose could denote delicacy. Ambergris whispered of travel and exotic knowledge. Cloves suggested both status and a careful attention to survival. Scents could attract attention, curry favor, or simply help one pass unnoticed amid the odors of crowded streets and bustling halls. And yet, despite all this care, the smellscape of the castle remained complex. The kitchens were never far, their smoke and cooking mingling with the perfume and the less controllable human odors. Servants moved through corridors carrying buckets of water, piles of laundry, or mounds of firewood, leaving trails of scent in their wake. Horses, pigs, and dogs, when present, added another layer. Even the floorboards, the walls, and the tapestries held the accumulated memories of previous inhabitants, their odours locked into the very fibres of the rooms. The contrast between natural and artificial scents was stark. A noble might inhale deeply of lavender, masking the tang of weeks-old sweat and unbrushed hair, only to step into a hall where the mingled aroma of a dozen meals, animals, and unwashed bodies demanded immediate defense. Perfume was a survival strategy, a subtle assertion that order existed, even when the body had long surrendered to the inevitabilities of medieval life. Ritual extended beyond the dressing itself. The act of applying perfume, sprinkling rosewater, or adjusting a pomander was deliberate, almost meditative. It created a sense of control, a psychological shield against the chaos of daily existence. You can imagine a noblewoman standing before a mirror, adjusting a silk veil, then bending slightly to wave a pomander beneath her nose, inhaling and exhaling carefully, masking the faint tang of her own breath. Each movement is purposeful, a combination of grace and necessity. Even the language of fragrance was codified. Certain scents were considered medicinal, believed to protect against illness, repel miasmas, or sharpen the senses. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were more than exotic imports. They were tools. Saffron might be ground into a fine powder and scattered in chambers to freshen the air. Herbs hung from beams or sewn into garments could be warmed by body heat, releasing their subtle powers as the day progressed. In every case, smell was both aesthetic and functional. The clever use of scent extended to social interactions as well. A noble entering a room could announce their presence without speaking, a subtle waft of perfume preceding them like a herald. Similarly, the absence of scent might signify neglect or poverty, a warning to others about a person's social standing or adherence to etiquette. In a world where washing was optional and filth was common, aroma became an unspoken language, a way to assert control over perception and status. Even the most meticulous rituals couldn't entirely erase the realities beneath. Under layers of silk and velvet, under pomanders and sprinkled herbs, the body remained vulnerable to the same sweat, lice, and decay that afflicted all humans. But in a society that prized appearances and sensory command, the illusion was enough. Perfume allowed nobles to navigate crowded halls, feasts, and councils with dignity, projecting an image of refinement even as the body itself told a different story. And so perfume was much more than a fragrance. It was a shield, a strategy, a statement. It masked what was unavoidable, disguised what was socially unacceptable, and allowed the wealthy to maintain an outward appearance of civilization amid the inevitable realities of medieval living. It created a buffer between the private truths of the body and the public stage of life, where smell was as powerful as sight. As you watch the ritual unfold, the careful wrapping of garments, the sprinkling of rosewater, the swinging of a pomander, you realize that survival in this world was often about perception as much as protection. Scent becomes armor, clothes become barriers, and the noble emerges into the hall, ready to meet the eyes of peers and strangers alike. And yet, for all this preparation, for all the elegance and aroma, the medieval body remained prone to the whims of the age. Disease lurked in the air, decay lingered in teeth, and discomfort persisted beneath silk and velvet. Perfume, for all its power, was a tool, one layer in a complex system of coping with a world that demanded both resilience and presentation. Soon, we move from these fragrant chambers into the slightly more clinical, though no less dramatic, world of medieval medicine. Here, doctors, leeches, and bloodletting bowls take center stage, offering another layer of protection and ritual, this time for the body's interior rather than its exterior. Now let's wander into a quieter, eerier part of medieval life, the intersection where hygiene, superstition, and medicine all collide. It's a place that smells faintly of vinegar, iron, and herbs, where the boundaries between care and ritual blur, and where the quest for health takes forms that might make a modern mind shudder. Health, in the medieval imagination, was rarely about cleanliness. Soap, water, and brushes could soothe the skin, but they had little to do with the true science of life. True health meant balance. The balance of the humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, four invisible liquids coursing through the body determining temperament, vitality, and susceptibility to illness. Too much or too little of anyone could tip you into disease, madness, or death. A headache might be treated with herbs, yes, but also by letting a bit of blood flow from the arm, leg, or temple to restore harmony. You enter a barber surgeon's room. It's deceptively calm. Light filters through a small window, striking the polished steel of razors arranged like instruments of ritual. Bowls gleam on wooden tables, some filled with water, some with blood from previous sessions, carefully washed but never quite sterile by modern standards. Vials of herbs, powders, and tinctures line the shelves. A pot of vinegar simmers faintly on the hearth. And then you see the leeches. Small, wriggling black and brown bodies waiting in shallow water. People believe that leeches can draw out not only blood, but also the excess humours that might harbour evil, imbalance, or impending illness. A noble reclines on a table while the barber surgeon chooses a leech, carefully positioning it on the arm or leg. The patient may feel a slight pinch, then a slow tugging sensation as the creature works. Blood flows, considered both cleansing and corrective, a way to restore equilibrium to the body's mysterious interior world. The room smells faintly of iron, herbs, and something faintly sour. Perhaps the faint remnants of previous patients. The air feels heavy with expectation. People come here not only because they are sick, but because they believe that filth, imbalance, or spiritual corruption can manifest in the humours. Dirt, sweat, and even the odours of daily life are thought to interact with these humours, sometimes for the worse. Washing may be suspicious, perfumes may be protective, and a clean wound is as much a moral statement as a medical necessity. Imagine a young apprentice observing quietly, hands folded, eyes wide. He watches the surgeon draw blood, the leech's wriggling movements, the careful measurement of herbs. Every action is deliberate, precise, steeped in centuries of observation, tradition, and superstition. A poultice of herbs is placed on a swollen joint. A cup is applied to the back to draw impurities upward. Patients accept discomfort, believing in the ritual's efficacy. Pain, after all, is part of purification. Barber surgeons also perform more ordinary tasks, trimming hair, shaving beards, cleaning teeth as best they can. But each act is coloured by the larger understanding of health. A haircut isn't just aesthetic. It might prevent disease, keep humours balanced, or even protect against spirits believed to linger in matted hair. A shave may reduce lice or fleas, but also fulfills a symbolic function, an assertion of order over the body's chaotic tendencies. You can imagine the mix of tension and trust in the room. People come here willingly despite the strange smells, the wriggling leeches, and the occasional screaming of pain. They believe the humours must be corrected, that imbalance is dangerous, that even decay and filth have a place in the choreography of medicine. Dirt isn't merely tolerated. In some cases, it is necessary. A wound allowed to air out may draw out evil. Sweat might release excess humours. The idea of sterile cleanliness has no meaning here. Instead, ritual, observation, and folklore guide every action. Some treatments verge on theatrical. Bloodletting might be accompanied by prayers, chants, or the careful arrangement of herbs around the table. Leeches are applied in specific sequences, sometimes to the temples, arms, or legs, depending on the type of imbalance diagnosed. A gentle hum of conversation might accompany the procedure. Patients sharing advice, apprentices asking questions, the barber surgeon instructing softly. But underneath it all lies the quiet rhythm of life and death, health and misfortune, all played out in a space scented with iron and sage. The public also intersects with these practices. Traveling physicians and barber surgeons often set up shop in the market square, tents flapping in the wind, leech jars on display. People consult them not only for illness but for minor ailments, curiosity, or ritualistic reassurance. A child with fever, a merchant with a toothache, a noble with a bad temper, all might submit to a careful procedure, trusting that balance and ritual are more important than immediate comfort. Interestingly, the understanding of filth itself is paradoxical. Dirt and grime might be repulsive, but in moderation, they are believed to serve as a form of protection. Overwashing could open pores to disease, a layer of sweat might prevent the intrusion of harmful spirits or imbalance. In this sense, the barber surgeon's room becomes a theatre where the tensions between hygiene, superstition, and medical practice play out. Even wounds are treated with this dual mindset. Poultices of herbs, honey, or vinegar are applied not only for antiseptic reasons, though that may be effective by chance, but because each ingredient is believed to have spiritual or humoral properties. A careful combination of bitter and sweet herbs might counteract bad blood. The wound is left exposed, wrapped, or drained according to rules that seem arbitrary to us, but made perfect sense in a worldview where the body is a vessel of invisible forces. And then there's the quiet patience of observation. A barber surgeon doesn't simply act. He watches the patient's pulse, examines the tongue, listens to complaints. Every symptom is a sign from the humors, every expression a message from the body's unseen chemistry. Filth, odors, and decay are not merely incidental, they are data, evidence of imbalance or imminent disease. Patients learn to navigate this strange, sensory world. They endure discomfort, embrace rituals that seem odd to outsiders, and accept that cleanliness is sometimes secondary to harmony. A bath might weaken the humors, a clean wound might invite evil. Leeches, bowls of blood, herbs, and subtle scents form a constellation of practices designed to maintain life in a world where logic and superstition coexist seamlessly. Even when no illness is present, people visit these rooms for prophylactic measures. A routine bloodletting, a cleansing poultice, or the careful observation of humors. They trust the ritual as much as the substance, the symbolism as much as the science. And all the while, the quiet ticking of medieval life continues outside, the streets bustling, the animals moving, the smells of the town mingling with the faint tang of iron and herbs inside. It is a world where hygiene, medicine, and superstition intertwine, where dirt can protect, where blood can heal, and where the smell of life itself is as much a guide as any instrument or herb. Patients and practitioners alike move in a choreography that balances fear, hope, and centuries of inherited knowledge. And so the barber surgeon's room, with its gleaming razors, wriggling leeches, and bowls of blood, becomes a lens into the medieval approach to health. Here, the body is treated not as a clean vessel, but as a complex system of humors influenced by air, diet, and ritual. Hygiene and medicine dance together in ways both strange and strangely effective, shaping lives in a world that understands disease as an imbalance rather than a result of microbes. As the patient rises, pale but steady, having surrendered blood and trust to the procedure, you can feel the quiet order of the room. The ritual has been performed, the humors nudge toward equilibrium, and life continues. Outside, the streets await, filled with chaos, smells, and the inevitable consequences of a society where sanitation is uneven and survival depends on adaptation. From here, the journey carries us back outside the calm of the surgeon's chamber, into the chaos of medieval life. The streets beckon, full of noise, odor, and the daily realities that remind everyone that civilization itself is messy, thriving atop a foundation of filth. Let's step back from the controlled chaos of the barber surgeon's room and venture into the open, chaotic heart of medieval cities, the streets themselves. Imagine a morning sun just beginning to warm the cobblestones, but the light does little to disguise what lies upon them. Every step carries the history of human life, the accumulated residue of days, weeks, and sometimes months. Mud churned by feet and hooves, the tang of dung both human and animal, rotting scraps of food, the occasional remnants of a butcher's trade, all blending into a single, complex, living carpet. You wander slowly, observing as if walking through an enormous compost heap that hums with vitality. Children dart between puddles, squealing with laughter, their bare feet squelching in the mix of mud and refuse. They chase each other, kick at the debris and slide on slippery patches, entirely unbothered by the layer of filth that coats the town. Their play is intimate with the ground itself. The stones, the muck, the decaying vegetables, a tactile education in survival, sensory and immediate. Pigs snuffle through alleyways, rooting for scraps, sniffing every corner as if reading the city's diary. Their hooves churn the mud further, mixing it with waste and water, creating a living, breathing mixture that smells of earth, sweat, and time itself. Chickens and dogs weave among the humans, sometimes scattering and squawking, sometimes moving slowly, methodically, sniffing at the ground as if to catalogue every morsel of refuse. The streets are narrow, buildings leaning over the cobbles like tired guardians. Overhanging upper stories cast shadows, sheltering piles of discarded refuse that never seem to diminish. Every corner has its own bouquet, the acrid tang of urine mingled with the sour bite of spoiled milk, the metallic tang of blood from yesterday's slaughter, the faint sweetness of decomposing fruits. Flies hover lazily, landing on everything in sight, tracing invisible patterns across stone, wood, and flesh. Merchants call out, attempting to sell wares from carts that balance precariously over the muck. Bread, meat, cheese, cloth, all offered without concern for cleanliness beyond basic presentation. You might step aside, narrowly avoiding a puddle thick with grime, and pause to watch a horse plod slowly by, adding its own contribution to the tapestry of the street. The rhythm of the city is alive, noisy, and odorous, yet in its own way predictable. Even in the wealthier districts, cleanliness is relative. The cobbles are slightly better maintained, but the smell never entirely vanishes. Servants sweep and pour water, but the layers of mud and waste ground into the stones over decades resist every attempt at erasure. Every alley, every corner, every doorway is a reminder that civilization grows atop a foundation of filth, that what we call urban life is inseparable from the organic reality beneath it. Food stalls, when busy, contribute to the olfactory symphony. Roasted meats drip grease onto boards that sit above layers of straw and sawdust, sometimes falling directly to the street. Fruits are displayed next to discarded peelings. Vendors sweep irregularly, often simply pushing waste a few feet down the alley. The smells mingle with the warm, sour scent of human sweat from crowded spaces, creating an aroma that is complex, rich, and entirely natural to the inhabitants. You notice the way people navigate this world. A merchant steps carefully over a puddle, lifts a child by the hand, ducks under a low-hanging sign. Every action is measured, almost ritualized, a choreography developed through years of interaction with the environment. Travelers might gag at first, but the locals are adapted. Their noses filter the odors like an unspoken skill, their feet learn the slick spots, their eyes measure the safe path. Survival in this context is sensory, intuitive, and continuous. There is also a strange beauty to it if you look closely. Mud glistens like wet stone under the sun. Broken bread, half buried in debris, becomes an accidental mosaic of texture and color. Piles of discarded vegetables flecked with soil hint at the agricultural rhythm of the surrounding countryside. Animals move through it like living brushes, shaping patterns that change by the hour. The streets, though filthy, are alive in ways our modern, sanitized world rarely allows. At the edges of the main thoroughfares, side alleys hide small households, often with their own layer of refuse. Buckets and chamber pots line the entrances, emptied directly onto the street or into shallow ditches. Laundry dries over puddles, releasing the faint scent of soap, vinegar, or old sweat, mingling with everything else. It is a sensory overload, chaotic, layered, sometimes harsh. Yet to those who live within it,
It is simply life. Children's play continues undeterred.
they roll through puddles, chase chickens, and sometimes lie down in the mud to rest, learning early that contact with filth is inevitable, unavoidable, and even enjoyable. Their skin, clothes, and hair carry the city with them: soil, dung, straw, and the faint tang of meat and ale. This intimacy with the environment creates resilience, a tactile understanding of the rhythm of urban life in the Middle Ages. Animals are constant companions in this urban landscape, pigs rooting for scraps, dogs sniffing at every corner, cats weaving silently along walls. They share the streets, the smells, and the debris. Their existence is both nuisance and necessity. They help dispose of waste, keep vermin in check, and maintain the unspoken ecology of the city. Humans have adapted alongside them, walking in tandem with hooves, claws, and paws. Their daily lives a negotiation with every living creature in their midst. The pace of life here is slow and observational. You might stop to watch a woman carrying a basket of vegetables, her feet sinking into mud and slurry, her face unconcerned by the flies buzzing around. A child kicks a piece of rotten fruit, sending a squelch of juice over the cobbles. A man drags a cart, the wheels cutting grooves into the soft, smeared surface. Everything moves in rhythm, a combination of intent, chance, and adaptation. And yet, even within this chaos, there is a social order. Markets have designated areas. Certain streets are reserved for trade, others for traffic, and each household negotiates its own boundary with the street. The muck may be omnipresent, but it is also managed, minimally but consistently. People develop strategies to coexist with it, balancing avoidance, participation, and adaptation. Life in the street is messy but not ungoverned. Smells, of course, dominate. The combined tang of human and animal waste, rotting food, and everyday life can be overwhelming at first. But in time, it becomes background noise, a constant companion, neither pleasant nor truly offensive to those who live with it. Flies, ever present, provide a buzzing soundtrack. The air is heavy with moisture, odor, and the faint dust of dried mud, creating a sensory environment that is immersive, persistent, and instructive. And through it all, the rhythm of human activity continues. Merchants shout their wares, children squeal in play, pigs grunt and shuffle, carts creak over cobblestones, dogs bark, and the occasional church bell tolls in the distance. Life moves forward in its noisy, odorous, and beautiful way, each individual contributing to the city's living tapestry. Walking slowly through this medieval metropolis, you begin to understand the subtle complexity of everyday survival. Civilization here is not neat or clean. It is layered, messy, and intimately connected to the organic processes that sustain it. Mud Dung, decay, and refuse are not aberrations. They are part of the rhythm, part of the sensory fabric, and part of what allows life to continue in dense, human-packed spaces. Soon as you leave the streets behind, the focus narrows again, moving from the shared chaos of the city into the solemn interior of medieval institutions. The church, with its rituals, moral teachings, and attention to the body, offers another lens through which hygiene, health, and human perception are intertwined. Now let's step quietly into the hushed corridors of medieval religious life, where the body and the soul were intertwined in ways both strict and peculiar. Here, in monasteries, churches, and chapels, hygiene was not merely a matter of cleanliness. It was a reflection of morality, spirituality, and the eternal struggle between flesh and spirit. The act of washing, the exposure of skin, and even the scent of the body were laden with meaning far beyond mere health. Imagine a monastery at dawn. Candles gutter softly in the corners, their warm light flickering across stone walls. Monks rise slowly, moving along the cold floor in bare feet, their robes brushing the ground. They carry out rituals that govern not only the soul but also the body. Hand-washing before prayers is meticulous but limited. It extends no further than the wrists, sometimes including the face and feet. Full-body bathing is rare and in some contexts discouraged. It is seen as indulgence, vanity, a temptation that could distract from spiritual contemplation. The body is a vessel, yes, but not one to be pampered excessively. Dirt, sweat, and the faint tang of unwashed skin are tolerated, even embraced, as reminders of human frailty and the transient nature of earthly life. Confessions sometimes carry a subtle, almost humorous humanity. A monk, kneeling in the quiet gloom, might murmur not only of sins of the mind and spirit, but also of the desire for soap, the temptation of hot water, the longing for the soft comfort of a bath. These confessions are whispered, private, yet shared, in the intimacy of ritual. They reveal the tension between spiritual purity and physical need, a tension that is both deeply serious and quietly human. For the wider populace, religious teachings shaped everyday life. Bathing was sometimes regarded with suspicion because it could foster vanity, the sinful focus on one's own appearance. Nudity, even in private, was morally fraught. Cleanliness, in the eyes of some spiritual authorities, was secondary to humility, piety, and moral vigilance. The body, in all its natural odor and texture, was a reminder of original sin, a fragile vessel that could not be fully trusted, yet had to be endured. Despite this, rituals offered strange comfort. Washing hands before meals, sprinkling water at the threshold of a church, or anointing oneself with scented oils carried symbolic weight. They were acts of protection, purification, and reverence. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of order imposed on the messy, chaotic reality of the body. Even when soap was scarce, when water was cold, or when the air was thick with odors of city streets or crowded halls, these rituals provided reassurance, a small domain of control amid the unpredictability of life. Monastic life provides a vivid illustration. Imagine a monk sitting at a long wooden table, hands rubbed in coarse cloth or sprinkled with a little water, preparing for prayer. His feet, calloused and tired from hours of standing, are washed in a basin at the threshold. The rest of the body remains untouched, cloaked in robe and habit, carrying the scent of unwashed skin, straw bedding, and the faint tang of herbs used in cooking or healing. Here, filth and spiritual practice coexist, unremarkable to the practitioner, but striking to an outsider. Even religious festivals, when people gathered in large numbers, maintained this delicate balance. Pilgrims crowded into cathedrals, cloisters, and chapels, bringing with them every scent of travel, sweat, dust, and the faint traces of food and animal encounters. Yet inside the air was thick with incense, candle smoke, and the faint aroma of herbs burned for protection or ritual. The juxtaposition of physical filth and spiritual sanctity created a layered sensory environment, one that reinforced the teachings: the body is imperfect, but the soul can aspire to perfection. Priests and abbots preached about hygiene in ways that often conflated morality with cleanliness. Excessive washing could be a temptation, a focus on the self rather than on God. Soap, when available, might be used sparingly, reserved for hands and face, rather than the indulgence of full baths. The spiritual economy demanded restraint. Bodily care was a secondary, sometimes dangerous concern. Yet there was acknowledgement of necessity. Hands and feet were symbolic entry points, visible reminders of piety and devotion, washed to prepare for prayer and service. The Church also offered guidance through ritual and routine, integrating bodily awareness with spiritual discipline. Pilgrimages involved long walks, exposure to the elements, and little opportunity for bathing. Yet they were considered purifying. The hardships of travel, the accumulation of dirt and sweat, were reframed as evidence of devotion, a physical expression of spiritual commitment. In this context, the natural filth of the body was not shameful, but honored, a testament to endurance and faith. For the lay people, these teachings filtered into everyday life. People accepted the presence of dirt, odors, and natural bodily processes as ordinary, even morally acceptable, unless they reflected vanity or neglect of piety. Soap and bathing were intermittent, valued more for ritual than for personal pleasure. Perfume and fragrant herbs, as previously explored, could mask smells without challenging spiritual teachings, a pragmatic compromise between earthly comfort and religious adherence. The contrast between spiritual purity and physical filth becomes striking in monastic settings. Cells are Spartan, beds simple, water limited. The air carries the subtle scent of herbs, wax, and occasional sweat, but never the overwhelming odors of city streets. Monks move with quiet purpose, performing rituals, chanting prayers, and observing silence. Every act of washing, anointing, or touching water carries symbolic weight, teaching patience, humility, and self-restraint. Dirt is tolerated because it reminds the faithful of the impermanence and imperfection of the human condition. Even confession reveals the interplay of body and spirit. People do not merely confess misdeeds, they confess indulgences, desires, and small secret longings for comfort, including hygiene. There is a gentle humor in imagining these private admissions. A whispered longing for a bath, a fleeting wish for soft linen, a subtle acknowledgement of the pleasure of warmth. The confessional becomes a space where human need meets spiritual aspiration, a reconciliation of flesh and soul in quiet, whispered terms. And yet, the physical reality is ever present. The smell of unwashed skin, the grit under fingernails, the tang of sweat lingering in clothing, all of it coexists with ritual, prayer, and moral instruction. Life in medieval religious communities and among devout lay people is thus characterized by a layered approach. The body is imperfect, filth is natural, and the soul is sovereign. Daily rhythms, prayer, work, meals, and sleep integrate this understanding, offering structure, comfort, and reassurance in a world where cleanliness is optional and spirituality is paramount. Even within the grandeur of cathedrals where incense wafts above polished stone floors, the reality of human presence asserts itself. Pilgrims press close together, boots scuffing stone, hands brushing against one another. Sweat, dust, and faint odors mingle with the scent of burning resin and candles. The contrast of sanctity and corporeality is vivid, creating an environment both sobering and strangely comforting. Filth is tolerated, not ignored. It is part of the rhythm of devotion, the constant reminder that humans are fragile vessels, striving for something greater. In the quiet corners of monasteries and churches, this philosophy shapes everything. How often one washes, which parts of the body are cared for, the rituals of confession, and the gentle acceptance of natural odors. Dirt is reframed, no longer merely unpleasant, but meaningful. The interplay of spiritual aspiration and physical limitation becomes a source of comfort, a reassurance that imperfection is natural, and that cleanliness, while sometimes desirable, is not the ultimate measure of virtue. The medieval approach to the body, shaped by religion, thus provides both structure and tolerance. Physical filth is acknowledged, even ritualized, while spiritual cleanliness is paramount. Washing hands and feet before prayer, enduring heat and cold without indulgence, confessing both moral and bodily failings, all create a system in which the human body is imperfect but manageable, and the soul remains the ultimate focus. And so, as we step back from the chapels and cells, from the rituals and whispered confessions, the next layer of life awaits. From here, we turn toward the ways in which fashion, clothing, and adornment intersect with dirt and daily existence, a world where garments absorb, display, and even celebrate the unavoidably messy realities of medieval living. Now let's turn our attention to the fabrics that clothed medieval bodies, not merely as decoration, but as living records of sweat, toil, and the unavoidable accumulation of daily life. Clothing was a second skin, a persistent witness to existence, imbued with odors, textures, and the memories of repeated wear. Wool, linen, and coarse blends dominated, each carrying its own burdens. Wool was warm but scratchy, often rubbing against the skin to create small irritations, sweat trapped in its dense fibers. Linen, softer and more breathable, became heavy with moisture and slowly acquired the tang of body oils, dirt, and food spills. Imagine walking into a chamber where garments are piled high, stacked on benches and chairs, draped over the backs of stools. You can almost smell the sour tang of repeated wear, the faint fermentation of sweat and body oils, mingling with smoke from the hearth. Each article of clothing tells a story. The tunic, worn during the market trip, the hose patched repeatedly at the knee, the gown that has seen 3 feasts and 1 particularly vigorous dance. Clothes were precious. They were mended, turned, and reused until they could no longer serve their purpose. Fabric was not disposable. It was survival, thrift, and status, all woven into one. Laundry, when it occurred, was arduous labor. It was primarily the domain of women, who labored over kettles of steaming water, agitating heavy fabrics with hands reddened and chapped by constant friction. Soap, when available, was harsh, often homemade from animal fats and ashes, cutting into the skin as it stripped away grime. Clothes were beaten with wooden paddles, scrubbed over stones, wrung out repeatedly, and then hung or laid near the hearth to dry. Even with this effort, garments rarely emerged entirely clean. The fibers retained odors, the folds held remnants of previous wear, and in the damp winters, drying was slow, leaving clothing to acquire a musty, sour scent that mingled with the body's own natural aromas. For nobles, layers added complexity. Each tunic, surcoat, and mantle could carry the residue of days, with undergarments rarely changed more than once or twice a week. Velvet and brocade absorbed the scent of the wearer, perfumes and smoke from torches and fires. Gloves and caps trapped sweat and oils, gently preserving the body's presence within the fabric. Laundry, when performed, was a ritual as much as a chore, undertaken carefully and sparingly, a recognition of both value and labor. Peasants, on the other hand, faced harsher realities. Their clothing was fewer in number, coarser in material, and worn until it literally disintegrated. Woolen tunics, patched repeatedly, carried the smell of work, fields, animals, mud, and sweat. Linen shifts might be washed in cold rivers or heated cauldrons, but the process was slow, brutal, and never fully effective. Children often wore the hand-me-downs of older siblings, which meant that their daily movements were accompanied by the combined odors of many previous lives. Every garment, every thread, was a palimpsest of activity, toil, and survival. Even footwear, which might seem a minor detail, tells its own story. Leather shoes were rarely cleaned beyond a quick scrape or rub of wax. Mud and grime became embedded in soles, carrying faint scents and textures into every building and home. Boots, softened by water and sweat, molded to the foot over time, absorbing each step, creating a private map of movement across streets, alleys, and fields. Socks, often woolen, were laundered infrequently. The combination of heat, moisture, and repeated wear made them almost living companions of smell and texture. The process of mending clothing was itself a labor-intensive ritual. Needles and thread were used to patch holes, reinforce worn edges, and turn garments inside out to extend their lives. Buttons, clasps, and ties were repaired or replaced. Even minor repairs required attention and skill, as poorly executed stitching could tear fabrics further. Women, mothers, daughters, and servants often spent hours performing these tasks, sometimes by the dim light of a candle or in the brisk air of an open doorway. Each motion carried both patience and necessity, and the result was a garment that bore the marks of repeated care and constant endurance. The tactile experience of wearing these clothes was intense. Rough wool rubbed against the skin, creating subtle irritations that became part of daily sensation. Linen, damp from sweat or occasional washing, clung uncomfortably, giving the wearer a constant reminder of the body beneath the fabric. Over time, the body and garments melded, creating a shared rhythm, an intimate awareness of cloth, fiber, and skin, interwoven with daily labor, activity, and survival. Even as fabrics absorbed sweat, dust, and daily grime, scent remained a complex language. Perfumes, herbs, and scented sachets might be tucked between layers, applied to undergarments or linings. These were not merely cosmetic, they served to mediate the persistent odors of daily life. A faint trace of lavender or rosemary in a woolen doublet offered a small relief, a psychological buffer, against the unavoidable reality of accumulated dirt and sweat. Clothing was also a form of social signaling. Despite the odors, rags could denote status and profession. A richly embroidered gown might carry the faint tang of incense and sweat alike, while a simple wool tunic bore evidence of work, stamina, and practicality. The scent and texture of garments were read, consciously or unconsciously, by those around, providing cues about wealth, occupation, and social standing. The body itself might be hidden or subdued, but the clothing was a living, tactile, and olfactory document of existence. You can almost imagine leaning over a hearth, holding a damp, sour-smelling tunic, feeling the weight of waterlogged wool and linen in your hands. The steam rises, carrying with it the mixed aromas of cloth, smoke, and faintly fermented body oils. Outside, children play in mud, animals shuffle through streets, and the city continues its rhythm. Laundry is never-ending, garments are never truly clean, and yet this is life, a continuous cycle of wear, repair, scent, and survival. The smells, textures, and rhythms of clothing become a part of identity. The body and fabric form a single experience, a tapestry of sensation, scent, and memory. Each garment tells a story of labor, adaptation, and endurance. It is intimate, unglamorous, and profoundly human. Even in noble houses where washing was slightly more frequent and fabrics more elaborate, the same principles applied. The body's natural realities were impossible to escape, and clothing bore witness to the persistence of daily life. Laundry labor itself became a rhythm of the household. Women and children worked in tandem, lifting heavy fabrics, scrubbing with soap, rinsing in cold water, wringing and pounding, and finally laying garments to dry by the hearth or on rudimentary lines. The process was exhausting, unending, and rarely fully effective, leaving the clothes carrying faint memories of every previous wearer. By the time garments returned to use, they were imbued with history, scent, and the tactile evidence of survival. And so clothing in the Middle Ages was inseparable from dirt. It was functional, symbolic, and sensory, a second skin that mediated life, labor, and social perception. Fabrics absorbed sweat, odor, and history, carrying with them the intimate realities of human existence. The threads, fibers, and patches formed a narrative as rich and complex as the streets, and bodies they covered. As we move from the intimate experience of garments into the broader realities of urban life, the next chapter awaits animals, plagues, and parasites. Here, the fabrics, the streets, and the body itself intersect with disease and vermin, creating another layer of complexity in the medieval world of hygiene and survival. Now let's expand our perspective again from the intimate closeness of clothing and streets to the creatures that shared every corner of medieval life. Animals were constant companions, co-workers, and sometimes threats, existing in a delicate and occasionally dangerous proximity to humans. Dogs padded across muddy floors, rats scuttled in the shadows, pigs snuffled in alleyways, and chickens scratched for morsels between feet and hooves. Occasionally, these animals even shared beds with humans, curling around legs or under blankets, providing warmth, companionship, and, unknowingly, a vector for disease. Imagine a small home or cottage. A fire sputters in the hearth, smoke rising lazily, while outside the winter cold presses against the walls. Inside, a family gathers around for a meal. Their dog rests near the hearth, breathing warmth onto bare feet. Chickens, confined in a corner for the night, cluck softly, sharing the same air as the family. Perhaps a pig or two lurks near the doorway, smelling for scraps and occasionally nudging a foot for attention. Rats, nearly invisible in the dim light, scuttle across rafters or through the cracks in the floor, always present, always watching. The coexistence is close, intimate, and unbroken. Animals are practical. They dispose of waste, eat what humans cannot, and provide warmth. But they are also conduits of dirt and disease. Fleas jump between fur and skin, lice move unnoticed in hair and bedding, and bedbugs trace the edges of mattresses and straw-filled pallets. Parasites are ubiquitous. They are neither entirely unwelcome nor easily eliminated. Every touch, every breath carries the silent accompaniment of small, unseen creatures that are as much a part of life as the humans themselves. The movement of disease, then, is subtle, almost invisible, but constant. Filth, water, and waste provide fertile ground for pathogens. Fleas, carried on rats and dogs, hop freely, and the body itself becomes a medium. Sweat-soaked clothing, unwashed linens, and shared bedding become vectors. In a world without germ theory, disease is attributed to imbalance, miasma, or spiritual punishment. Yet the reality is tangible. Bacteria and viruses spread along the narrow corridors of houses, the crowded streets, and the interwoven lives of humans and animals. Picture a city street in summer. Sunlight strikes the cobbles, but the smell of animal waste and rotting food dominates. Rats, nearly unafraid of humans, dart through the shadows. Chickens wander freely, pecking at scraps, brushing past legs, wings, and stray hair. Dogs follow their owners, noses sniffing every corner, sometimes leaving gifts behind. Pigs snuffle, lifting hooves over refuse and mud, the two worlds of animal and human intimately intertwined. Within this chaos, disease travels silently, hopping from one host to another, leaving traces in stomachs, skin, and, occasionally, in whispers of fever and illness. Fleas are a quiet, persistent presence, Tiny jumping punctures in skin produce an itch that is constant yet unremarkable to medieval people. Lice cling to hair, bedding and clothing, scratching and feeding with stealthy persistence. Bedbugs wait in corners and seams, biting during the night. These small creatures were universal companions, accepted, tolerated, and occasionally combated, yet always present, reminding humans of their fragile position in the web of life. Sometimes these small infestations contributed to larger, more catastrophic consequences. Early whispers of the Black Death carried by fleas on rats would eventually transform entire regions, reshaping social, economic, and cultural life. Long before the plague itself arrives, the conditions that allowed it to flourish are already present: crowded homes, shared bedding, unwashed bodies, and the unending proximity of humans and animals. In this sense, the medieval world is a landscape where daily life and hygiene, or lack thereof, become the silent collaborators of catastrophe. And yet there is a strange rhythm, almost comfort, in this coexistence. Families, animals, and parasites exist in an uneasy but manageable balance. Children grow up knowing the feel of a dog pressed against their legs at night, the tickle of fleas or lice, the subtle smell of cohabiting animals. Adults adapt their clothing, sleeping arrangements, and daily routines to accommodate these companions. Survival is not merely about cleanliness, but about negotiation, understanding the needs and habits of every living creature under one roof. The interplay of animals, disease, and humans extends outdoors as well. Markets, barns, and alleyways form a living ecosystem. Chickens scratch among piles of discarded vegetables, pigs root in mud and refuse, dogs patrol the boundaries, and rats slip through every hidden crack. The environment is sensory, dynamic, and alive, filled with the subtle movements and sounds of creatures that shape the human experience as much as any policy or practice. In these conditions, human adaptation is remarkable. People develop rituals of delousing, of moving bedding, of repairing and reusing garments. They may sprinkle herbs to repel pests or carry a small piece of rosemary or thyme in clothing. They may sleep with animals for warmth, brushing them when possible, adjusting their own routines to minimize bites or stings. The interdependence of species, the constant negotiation of filth, and the subtle management of disease create a complex, invisible choreography that defines everyday life. Disease, parasites, and dirt are woven into the fabric of medieval existence. Humans do not simply endure them. They navigate, adapt, and integrate them into the rhythms of daily life. The line between nuisance and normalcy blurs as even the most unpleasant creatures become familiar companions. Fleas and lice are omnipresent, rats are inevitable, and bedbugs are as routine as the morning meal. The body, the home, and the street all participate in a shared ecology that predates understanding but is profoundly practical. There is also humour, gentle and understated, in this reality. Imagine a noble adjusting his cloak while a rat scurries by unnoticed, or a child scratching under a coarse wool tunic while the family dog snores at their feet. Everyone has their companions, furry, tiny, or crawling, and the shared experience creates a quiet bond across social classes. From peasant huts to castle chambers, no one is exempt from the persistent, tactile presence of animals and the parasites they carry. Even the early warnings of plague exist in whispers rather than understanding. The signs are noticed: a sudden swell of rats, unusual bites, unexplained fevers. But the mechanisms remain mysterious. Filth, animals, and parasites are present everywhere, but they are not yet recognized as deadly partners in the unfolding drama of disease. For now, they are simply part of life, accepted, managed, and endured with the calm pragmatism that defined survival in the medieval world. Through this lens, the medieval experience becomes a story of coexistence. Humans live alongside animals and parasites, negotiating boundaries, scents, and behaviors in ways that are subtle, ongoing, and profoundly adaptive. Hygiene is not simply about washing or cleanliness. It is about understanding rhythms, tolerating discomfort, and balancing coexistence with the natural world. And as we follow this thread from the streets, homes, and bodies into the realms of power and piety, we find that dirt, animals, and disease are not evenly distributed. Some people live atop layers of privilege, some atop sacred rituals, and some at the mercy of survival itself. The next chapter brings us into the spaces where social status and spiritual significance shape the perception, acceptance, and management of filth. The world of royal dirt and sacred dirt. Now let's shift our gaze to the lofty heights of medieval society, where the opulent halls of kings and queens might suggest a world of cleanliness, refinement, and fragrant delight. And yet, the reality is delightfully, disturbingly familiar. The truth is simple. Royalty, despite silks, perfumes, and elaborate rituals, were no cleaner than the peasants whose streets they overlooked. They were simply better at disguising the evidence. A noble nose could be fooled by the scent of rosewater or clove, but the underlying stench and the natural odors of human life, sweat, and neglect remained just as stubbornly present. Consider the royal bath, an event less about hygiene than spectacle. Warm water, sometimes scented with herbs, might be poured into a large basin or tub. But baths were infrequent. Kings and queens, like the rest of the population, feared the chill, the effort, and even the notion that hot water could open the pores and invite disease. Baths were undertaken with ceremony. Attendants helping to undress and wrap, perfumed cloths at the ready, aromatic oils laid out for rubbing. But after the bath, the body quickly returned to its natural state. Sweating, dust, and the remnants of food and drink would reassert themselves, while the occasional flea, louse, or bedbug followed invisibly into silk sheets and velvet cushions. Bed linens, meanwhile, were not the pristine realms of fantasy. Sheets and blankets were layered, often shared, and rarely washed. Straw mattresses absorbed sweat, spittle, and body oils over weeks, months, or even years. The upper layers, decorative silks or fine linens, could be aired and lightly perfumed, creating a pleasant facade. But beneath the human body and its intimate companions, fleas, lice, and general dirt, remained unchanged. Even a queen's private chamber bore the same natural realities as a peasant hut, only softened by luxury and scent. Medical treatments in royal courts further illustrate the limits of status. Kings and nobles, advised by learned physicians or charlatans, might undergo bloodletting, leeching, or purging to restore balance to the humours. In theory, these were measures of health. In practice, they were messy affairs, rarely improving cleanliness, often introducing further odours and discomfort. Herbal poultices, aromatic powders, and fragrant oils were employed, partially to disguise the inevitable smells of illness and perspiration, partially to signal refinement and control. Even with attendants and elaborate rituals, the human body's natural functions could not be fully contained or hidden. Personal grooming in royal circles was as much theatre as hygiene. Combs, brushes, and small mirrors were employed with diligence, yet lice and nits persisted. Halitosis, long hair matted with oils, and the faint smell of sweat were realities even within palace walls. The luxurious fabrics of clothing absorbed every scent, every droplet of perspiration, every stray particle of food. Perfume, pomanders, and powders created a delicate mask, a suggestion of cleanliness rather than actual sanitation. The noble person, like the peasant, remained fundamentally human, bound by the same biological truths, yet able to cloak them in illusion. Meals, feasts, and banquets add another layer. The scent of roasted meats, wine, and rich sauces mingled with the natural odors of bodies, creating a complex olfactory tapestry. Courtiers, attendants, and royalty alike shared the same rooms, breathing the same air, touching the same fabrics. While the table might be a display of abundance and refinement, it was also a shared ecosystem of smell and bacteria, a microcosm of the wider world where human and animal life intersected with hygiene, or the lack thereof. Irony becomes unavoidable when considering royal ritual baths versus everyday survival. A monarch might soak in water scented with lavender or rose petals, attended by servants, yet within hours the familiar odors of work, exercise, and proximity to animals would reassert themselves. The effort is symbolic, demonstrating wealth, control, and refinement, but the underlying reality, sweat, lice, and body oils, remains unchanged. This is the medieval truth. Status can conceal, mask, and suggest, but it cannot fully erase biology. Even clothing, carefully layered and perfumed, carries the same story. Silks, velvets, and fine linens are aired and brushed, sometimes lightly scented, but they retain the subtle traces of human activity. Fabrics mold to the wearer's body, recording posture, movement, and the unavoidable evidence of daily life. The aristocrat may appear impeccable, yet closer inspection, or time spent in their chambers, reveals the same intimate human traces that exist in every home, hut, and hall. Royal dirt is mirrored by sacred dirt. Monks, nuns, and clergy, devoted to spiritual cleanliness, lived in conditions where physical filth was often unavoidable. Stone floors, communal dormitories, and sparse washing opportunities meant that the air, garments, and bedding carried the same odors and textures familiar to the streets. Hand washing and ritual purification offered symbolic relief, but the body remained firmly rooted in earthy reality. In both sacred and royal spaces there is a shared truth. Perfume, ritual, and ceremony provide comfort, dignity, and social signal, yet they cannot fully separate humans from the dirt that is part of their nature. There is humor here, subtle and wry. Imagine a king lifting a perfumed handkerchief to his nose, attempting to ignore the telltale signs of shared bedding, long days of counsel, and proximity to animals. Imagine a queen adjusting her gown, fragrant sachets tucked at her waist, while a flea invisibly traverses silk layers. The grandeur of royalty does not grant immunity from life's messiness. It only allows the illusion of control, a socially sanctioned pretense that can be carefully maintained for appearances. Even medical care, often extravagant, could not erase these truths. Physicians visiting royal courts carried tools for bloodletting, potions, and aromatic compresses. The procedures were elaborate, ceremonial, and intended to display knowledge and skill. Yet in practice they introduced new odors, new discomforts, and little real change in the basic state of the body. The human condition, sweaty, itchy, and often smelly, persisted unabated, proving that even power, wealth, and sacredness were no barrier to the realities of biology. In this way, royal dirt and sacred dirt are reflections of one another. Both demonstrate that status, perfume, and ceremony can mask but not eliminate the natural consequences of life. Humans, regardless of rank, remain vulnerable to lice, fleas, halitosis, and the faintly sour tang of repeated wear or activity. Rich fabrics and scented oils provide a delicate buffer, a layer of theatre that reassures the senses, but beneath it all, the body remains unmistakably human, a vessel of sweat, odor, and persistent intimacy with the natural world. And yet this masking carries psychological comfort. To sit on a velvet cushion, to wear fine silks, to apply rosewater and perfume, even while fully aware of underlying odors, is a form of agency. Royalty asserts control where possible, shaping perception and social interaction. sacred rituals perform a similar function, allowing monks, nuns, and clerics to impose spiritual order on a body and environment that remains fundamentally messy. In both cases, humans negotiate dignity, appearance, and comfort within the unchanging truths of life. The lesson is subtle. The wealthiest and most powerful, the holiest and most devout, cannot escape their humanity. They may create layers, a perfume, cloth, or ritual, that momentarily suspend reality, but the underlying biology, the intimate truths of the body, remain. Lice, fleas, and the faint stench of sweat persist. They are universal companions, indifferent to rank or sanctity. The medieval world, then, offers a wry and ironic perspective on human hygiene. Status, ritual, and perfume can create illusions, but they cannot fully rewrite biology. From here, we move naturally into the realm of medicine, where human ingenuity, superstition, and desperation combine in ways both miraculous and bizarre. The next chapter introduces the strange, sometimes grotesque, remedies of the medieval mind, the potions, poultices, and rituals designed to cure, cleanse, and protect against a world perpetually defined by dirt, disease, and the persistence of the body. Now let's step into the dim, aromatic, and occasionally alarming world of medieval remedies. A world where superstition, experimentation, and the desire for cleanliness created concoctions that might surprise or unsettle a modern nose. Apothecaries, both in town squares and tucked into narrow streets, offered a bewildering array of ingredients, jars of dried herbs, powders, roots, and sometimes the unthinkable, crushed snails, pigeon dung, and other substances that promised purification or protection. The line between medicine and hygiene blurred, as people sought not only to cure illness but to ward off odor, infection, and moral impurity. Imagine entering a small shop, its shelves groaning under the weight of bottles, jars, and sacks. The air is thick with the scent of dried flowers, pungent roots, and fermenting substances. Candles flicker in the corners, illuminating handwritten labels in Latin or the vernacular. Each ingredient carries a story, a belief, a promise of transformation. A pinch of powdered coral might prevent foul breath. A crushed snail mixed with honey could, according to legend, restore softness to skin. Pigeon dung applied as a paste was believed to clear blemishes and impurities from the face. To our modern sensibilities, these treatments are bizarre, even unpalatable, yet in their time they were serious, meticulously prepared, and widely trusted. Wine was a frequent component, not only for drinking but for cleaning and gargling. Nobles and commoners alike swirled it in their mouths, sometimes flavored with herbs or honey, in hopes of removing odor and preventing decay. Gargling was both a hygienic practice and a ritual. The liquid swished with deliberate care, then spat into basins or onto the ground, carrying with it the hope that breath, teeth, and even the spirit could be refreshed. The sensation, bitter, sweet, or tangy, left a lingering reminder of the body's vulnerability and the earnest efforts to manage it. Face masks and poultices ranged from the mildly aromatic to the shockingly pungent. Ground herbs, resins, and animal byproducts were combined, applied, and left to work their magic. People endured smells, textures, and the occasional mild irritation with stoic patience. The act of application itself became almost ceremonial, rubbed in, massaged lightly, and sometimes covered with cloth to enhance absorption. While the results were inconsistent, the process reinforced the idea that attention, ritual, and a tangible action could mitigate human imperfection, at least temporarily. Apothecaries also sold powders intended to combat odor in clothing and linens. Milled herbs, crushed flowers, and rare spices were sprinkled between layers of garments, tucked into folds, or dusted on mattresses. These powders did little to remove actual dirt, but offered the reassurance of intervention. Their scents, masked the persistent realities of human activity, sweat, food, and the faint but inevitable traces of animals and insects. In this way, ritual, aroma, and superstition created a sense of hygiene where true cleanliness was often impossible. The preparation of remedies was labor-intensive. Apothecaries ground, sieved, and blended, combining knowledge passed down through generations with personal observation. Some concoctions were potent, irritating the skin or producing unexpected reactions. Others were soothing, cooling, or subtly fragrant. Each potion, powder, or paste carried the dual promise of protection and prestige. Being seen to use them indicated care, attention, and even social status, transforming hygiene from a purely functional practice into a complex interplay of belief, ritual, and community expectation. Superstition often dictated not only ingredients but timing and method. Certain herbs were collected only at specific phases of the moon. Powders were mixed only on particular days. Remedies were sometimes applied in sequences designed to align with astrological guidance. These practices offered structure, a sense of control over the messy unpredictability of the body. Even when they were ineffective, the rituals themselves provided psychological reassurance, a subtle affirmation that humans were actively participating in their own protection and purification. Consider a noblewoman's morning routine. After rising, she might apply a poultice of ground herbs and animal matter to her skin, gargle with wine, sprinkle powders between her garments, and finish with a dash of rose water. The resulting scent was a complex overlay of sweetness, bitterness, and faintly earthy notes, a delicate mask for the natural odors beneath. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, and grounded in the belief that these interventions could stave off decay, disease, and social embarrassment. Even everyday, low-status households engaged in similar practices on a smaller scale. Herbs gathered from the garden, ashes from the hearth, or small amounts of vinegar were applied to hands, faces, or fabrics. Children learned early to accept these practices as part of daily life. There was comfort in the familiarity of grinding, mixing, and applying, a tactile, sensory experience that transformed cleaning into ritual, work into magic. The presence of strange ingredients, far from being alarming, became normalized, integrated into a worldview where dirt, disease, and moral balance were intimately linked. Animals also contributed to remedies. Feathers, eggs, and excrement were sometimes collected and repurposed into poultices or powders. While the connection between such materials and hygiene may seem tenuous, medieval minds operated on the principle of symbolic correspondence. Substances with certain qualities could influence the body, spirit, or luck. Insects, dirt, and the natural world were not merely obstacles. They were ingredients in the ongoing negotiation between filth, health, and social acceptability. The communal aspect of remedy-making cannot be overlooked. Women often prepared treatments together, sharing knowledge, techniques, and humor. Apothecaries served as hubs of observation and gossip, where tales of miraculous cures, bizarre failures, and unexpected reactions were exchanged. The social rhythm of preparation and application reinforced community ties, creating a shared sense of agency in a world defined by uncertainty, disease, and bodily imperfection. Humor, subtle and pervasive, often accompanied these practices. Imagine a nobleman grimacing as he applies a paste of ground snails to his face, servants chuckling quietly in the corner. Picture a child trying to gargle wine without grimacing, or a shopkeeper carefully weighing pigeon dung into a paste with solemn seriousness. These moments, while earnest, highlight the gap between intention and reality, the human capacity to find levity in the messy, aromatic, and unpredictable world of hygiene. Even the most exotic ingredients, powdered pearls, crushed gemstones, or imported spices were integrated into this system. They promised virtue, fragrance, or potency, Yet their efficacy was often indistinguishable from more mundane substitutes. The ritual itself mattered as much as the actual outcome. By participating, humans affirmed their agency over a body and environment that could never be fully controlled. In apothecaries, markets, and private chambers, the interplay of superstition, ritual, and practical need created a layered understanding of cleanliness. Remedies were simultaneously functional, symbolic, and social. They addressed physical discomfort, masked odors, and reinforced belief in control over an unpredictable body. Even when modern sensibilities recoil at the materials and methods, the logic of participation, of doing something tangible in the face of filth, disease, and bodily limitation, is clear and consistent. And so as we leave the pungent jars, powdered herbs, and ceremonial poultices behind, we are reminded that medieval hygiene was not only about water and cloth, it was about ritual, belief, and the active negotiation of an imperfect body within a complex world. These remedies, strange and sometimes repellent, reveal a society grappling with the natural realities of human existence: filth, disease, and the persistent presence of the body. From here, we turn to the subtler strategies of the nose, the ways in which scent, proximity, and perception shaped human interaction, comfort, and survival in the ever-present presence of odors, both natural and man-made. The next chapter, The Turning of the Nose, explores how medieval people navigated smell, hygiene, and social grace in a world without modern sanitation. Now let's follow the subtle, gradual shift in human sensibilities. The slow evolution from acceptance of filth to the dawning awareness that cleanliness could be desirable, even virtuous. By the late medieval period, ideas about hygiene began to stir. The Renaissance, with its renewed curiosity about the human body, science, and classical knowledge, brought a gentle, almost imperceptible change in attitudes. Bathing, once suspect and feared for opening the body to disease, was slowly reframed as a potential act of grace, a ritual that could align body and spirit rather than endanger them. Imagine walking through an early Renaissance town. Narrow streets still carry the persistent tang of waste, animals, and crowded life, but hints of innovation appear.
A fountain bubbles in a small square, its water clear and inviting, reflecting sunlight onto the cobblestones.
Cupping hands or cups to drink, perhaps splashing a small bit onto their faces. Water is no longer merely a vehicle for survival or a source of suspicion, it becomes a medium of refreshment, a subtle promise of revitalization. The act of bathing, once irregular and feared, begins to carry a social and even spiritual undertone. Soap, too, begins to emerge from obscurity. Composed initially of animal fats and ashes, its appearance in local markets signals a change in both availability and perception. Though still expensive and sometimes perfumed to disguise harshness, soap allows for more than ceremonial washing. It enables daily or semi-regular cleansing, a gentle rubbing away of the accumulated layers of sweat, dust, and residue that had long defined medieval life. The ritual transforms from a fearful or perfunctory task into an act of personal care and, increasingly, public acceptability. Sewers and drainage systems begin to appear in select towns and cities. Though primitive compared to modern sanitation, these structures represent a remarkable shift in civic thinking. Waste is guided away from streets, away from living quarters, and into carefully designed channels or pits. The cityscape itself starts to acknowledge the value of cleanliness, not yet universally, and certainly unevenly, but unmistakably. A passerby might notice less stagnation in certain alleys, fresher air near newly installed fountains, and the occasional spill of water that rinses away debris in a manner almost celebratory. Bathhouses experience a tentative revival. No longer solely condemned as dens of immorality, they are rediscovered as communal spaces for health, refreshment, and gentle social interaction. Wood, stone, and early plumbing guide water into large tubs, Scents of herbs and flowers mingle with the warmth of steam. Patrons approach bathing not with suspicion but with a dawning appreciation of comfort, sensory pleasure, and physical rejuvenation. The very act of immersion, once thought to invite disease, becomes a small, controlled indulgence, framed by ritual, etiquette, and emerging ideas of propriety. Personal grooming grows in significance. Hair, once oiled and infrequently washed, receives attention through combs and brushes, often enhanced by perfumed waters or powders. Fingers are washed more frequently, nails cared for, and faces treated with gentle ointments. While the full hygiene revolution is centuries away, the seeds are planted. Bodies are no longer passive repositories of filth, but active participants in their own presentation, comfort, and health. Observation, touch, and even scent gain new meaning in social interaction, with subtle etiquette guiding both action and perception. Consider a domestic scene, a family preparing for the day in a modest house, perhaps a merchant's or artisan's home. A small basin of water stands near the hearth. Soap is used sparingly but deliberately. Hands are washed, faces dabbed, hair smoothed. Children imitate adults, learning both the mechanics and the expectations of appearance. The ritual is quiet, unhurried, and imbued with a sense of order that contrasts with the earlier chaos of filth and neglect. Even without luxury, the philosophy of cleanliness begins to take root. Health theories begin to merge with practical hygiene. While humoral ideas still dominate, people notice that washing, rinsing, and removing visible grime often coincide with improved comfort, reduced odor, and a subtle sense of well-being. Medical treatises increasingly recommend bathing and cleansing, linking the body's external state to overall health. Fountains, basins, and early plumbing facilitate these recommendations, creating spaces where water, ritual, and emerging science converge. In urban centers, public fountains become both practical and symbolic. Children play at their edges, citizens gather to drink or wash hands, and merchants splash water over vegetables or counters. These fountains represent a new attitude that water, when properly harnessed, is not to be feared but embraced. The bubbling liquid, reflecting light and carrying freshness, offers a quiet meditation on the possibilities of hygiene, civic responsibility, and personal care. Even the elite, long accustomed to perfumed masks over natural odors, begin to embrace bathing and laundering as positive, restorative acts rather than mere illusions. Linen undergarments are washed and aired more frequently. Silk and wool garments are carefully maintained. The careful layering of fabrics and scents is augmented by genuine cleanliness, rather than merely an attempt to conceal reality. The distinction between ritual masking and functional hygiene begins to blur, as human understanding gradually aligns with observation and experience. Scent itself gains new cultural significance. The nose, once habituated to the persistent presence of filth and odor, becomes a site of discernment. Aromas are no longer only a method of concealment, but markers of status, health, and refinement. Herbs, flowers, and early perfumes enhance cleanliness rather than disguise it entirely. Fragrance becomes part of the emerging dialogue between the body, society, and environment, a subtle acknowledgement that odor is not merely natural but negotiable. The Renaissance also revives interest in classical texts in which bathing, diet, and bodily care were celebrated as part of moral and spiritual cultivation. Humanist thought encourages attention to the body, both as an instrument of divine creation and as a site of social engagement. Washing, grooming, and bathing are gradually reframed as acts of respect for oneself, for others, and for the natural harmony of body and spirit. Even as superstition lingers, practical observation strengthens the cultural value of cleanliness, and yet this transformation is gradual and uneven. Many streets remain familiar with mud, waste, and animal companions. Lice and fleas persist in homes. odors continue to punctuate urban life. The turning of the nose is subtle, a cultural shift as much as a physical one. People begin to appreciate the interplay between hygiene, perception, and well-being, learning to navigate, mitigate, and enjoy the sensory world in ways previously considered unnecessary or even dangerous. As water flows from fountains, as soap becomes more accessible, and as bathing regains its place in the rhythm of daily life, humans reclaim a measure of agency over their bodies. The act of turning the nose, literally and metaphorically, signifies attention, discernment, and subtle mastery over previously accepted filth. Cleanliness, long a luxury or a ritualized mask, becomes a lived experience, a gentle precursor to the sanitation and bathing revolutions of later centuries. In this transition, the medieval world slowly cedes its stubborn attachment to filth and superstition. Practices evolve, understanding deepens, and the body begins to be treated not merely as a site of endurance, but as an object of care, ritual, and practical maintenance. Yet the echoes of the past linger. Habits, odors, and the lessons of centuries of coexistence with filth continue to shape perception, shaping both caution and pleasure in interaction with the physical world. From here, we move naturally into our final reflection, the lingering traces of medieval hygiene in a modern, ostensibly clean world. How much of the past persists in our habits, fears, and assumptions? How does the history of filth inform the present? In the concluding chapter, Echoes of Dirt in Our Clean World, we trace these subtle, invisible continuities, connecting centuries of human experience in a calm, immersive reflection. And now, as we drift toward the gentle close of this long journey through centuries of dirt, ritual, and human ingenuity, let us linger in the quiet reflections that emerge when past and present meet. Imagine for a moment the soft rhythm of your own breath, the comfort of a warm blanket, the muted glow of a lamp beside you. Outside, the modern world hums in its familiar way, but within this calm space we carry traces of the past, echoes of a world where hygiene was an art, a superstition, a survival strategy, and, at times, a theatre of human imagination. Cleanliness, as we now understand it, was not always a moral imperative. Yet, over the centuries, these two ideas, the physical state of the body and the ethical status of the individual, have intertwined. Medieval people believed that filth could harbour spiritual corruption. Renaissance humans began to associate washing with virtue, and slowly across cultures and centuries, the notion took hold that to be clean is to be disciplined, proper, and socially desirable. Even today, a shiny sink, a fragrant bar of soap, or the gentle lather of a shower carries not only a promise of hygiene, but a quiet assertion of order and control. Perfume and cosmetics, born of necessity and imagination, survived the centuries in subtle but persistent ways. Rosewater, lavender oil, scented powders, once used to mask odors of body and environment, became fashion, luxury, and eventually markers of identity. Foundations, powders, lotions, and fragrant soaps in our modern cabinets owe a faint, invisible debt to the apothecaries, barbers, and cautious bathers of medieval times. Every dab, rub, or rinse is a whisper of a long history where humans sought to manage the body, negotiate comfort, and assert grace in the midst of inevitable filth. It is remarkable to consider how the definition of clean remains at its core cultural. Soap, running water, and toilets create a baseline of hygiene that is universally recognized today, yet the rituals surrounding them, the aesthetic choices, and the subtle judgments still echo ancient practices. Even now, the care with which we dry our hands, arrange towels, or select fragrances carries a muted sense of what is proper, polite, or desirable, a quiet continuation of the social and sensory choreography that began centuries ago. In our homes, we maintain spaces that are ostensibly sanitized, yet the imagination of filth persists. We store cleaning products on shelves, scented candles burn in corners, hand sanitizer sits in a hallway, and bathrooms carry a subtle promise: order, control, and the temporary suspension of decay. Each of these objects is imbued with centuries of human concern for hygiene, a faint echo of the medieval struggle with sweat, lice, mud, and odor. While the immediate threat may be gone, the lessons linger. Our bodies, our environments, and our senses are intimately intertwined, always negotiating balance, health, and comfort. Even rituals of washing and grooming bear the imprint of history. The pleasure of warm water running over hands, the careful scrubbing of nails, the lathering of soap across the body. These are not only physical acts, but a continuity of centuries of human experience. Each motion is both practical and symbolic, a personal assertion of control, comfort, and dignity. The care and attention paid to these rituals echoes the deliberate actions of apothecaries, barbers, nobles, and peasants alike, who labored, experimented, and imagined ways to live gracefully in a world where filth was inevitable. Consider the perfumes, the lotions, the subtly scented soaps in your own cabinet. Their presence is a gentle reminder that the human desire to manage odor, present oneself well, and create an ordered environment is timeless. What began as masking unpleasant realities has evolved into an art, a personal statement, and even a kind of pleasure. Yet, the underlying principle remains. Humans have always sought to negotiate their relationship with the body, the environment, and the inevitable presence of other organisms, whether lice, fleas, or the invisible microbial companions of every era. There is also a quiet humor in this continuity. The rituals of hygiene today, the careful application of soap, the fragrance of shampoo, the subtle airing of clothes, are, in some ways, descendants of medieval ingenuity, superstition, and necessity. The body remains a site of negotiation, always imperfect, always alive, and always requiring attention. And while we may be far removed from the streets of medieval towns, the lessons persist. Smell, sensation, and care remain central to our understanding of self and community. Even the very concept of dirt carries layers of meaning inherited from centuries past. Filth is no longer a constant presence in our daily lives, yet we remain acutely aware of it when encountered. A spill, a stain, or an unpleasant odor still prompts action, reflection, and correction. This sensitivity, refined over generations, is a subtle echo of the times when human survival, social acceptance, and spiritual well-being were intimately connected to managing the messiness of existence. As you settle deeper into your blanket, perhaps noticing the soft texture against your skin or the faint scent of your room, consider the invisible threads that tie you to this past. Medieval streets, crowded beds, communal baths, apothecaries' shops, and perfume chambers all leave traces in the human imagination, in our senses, and in our practices. Every faucet, every soap, every gentle scrub is a quiet continuation of a long story, a lineage of care, adaptation, and imaginative response to the realities of life. Our modern world, with its running water, clean linens, and fragrant products, is not a break from history, but a chapter in its continuation. The echoes of dirt, of clever disguises, and of imaginative remedies are embedded in the tools we use, the routines we follow, and even the expectations we have of ourselves and others. Cleanliness has become a canvas for comfort, fashion, morality, and health, yet beneath it all lies the human desire to manage the body and environment, a desire as old as history itself. And so in this quiet space, we drift toward a gentle awareness that every bubble of soap, every sprig of lavender, every carefully folded towel carries the faint memory of centuries spent negotiating filth, fashion, and survival. The medieval world is not gone. It lingers, subtle and persistent, in the shape of our rituals, our tastes, and our sense of propriety. Let your mind settle on the continuity of human experience. Feel the blanket's warmth against your skin, notice the soft aroma of soap or lotion, and recognize the invisible lineage of effort, ritual, and imagination that connects you to centuries of people who lived, laughed, endured, and imagined in the midst of filth. In this calm, reflective space, the medieval world becomes intimate, almost tactile, a quiet, persistent presence that we carry even into our modern bathrooms and beyond. As your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, let this awareness drift with you. The story of dirt, hygiene, and human ingenuity does not end. It evolves, echoing softly in the everyday, in the mundane, and in the subtle rituals that define our lives. The world has changed in countless ways, yet the faint imprint of the past remains, a delicate, enduring echo of our shared, messy, and surprisingly tender history.